Hey guys, tonight we step into the dust and heat of an empire that didn't just rise. It marched, disciplined and relentless, into the bones of history. You'll hear the thud of sandals against stone roads, the clink of chainmail, and the curt bark of Latin commands echoing through centuries. Smell the sweat, the iron, and the olive oil-slicked shields. But fair warning, you probably won't survive this. The Roman army doesn't tolerate slackers, and their training alone could break a grown man. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It began not in marble palaces or the Senate's chambers, but in muddy fields and ragged hills, where Rome, still a hungry young city-state, was constantly at war with its neighbors. Before emperors, before the grandeur, there were farmers and herders who became warriors because they had no other choice. Their homes needed defending. The earliest Roman soldiers weren't professionals. They were citizens, men called up during planting or harvest season, armed with whatever they could afford. A spear, a round shield, maybe a breastplate if their goat herd had been especially profitable that year. The Roman military system, at first, was like a neighborhood watch with pointy sticks. But it evolved. Oh, it evolved fast. Around the 4th century BCE, during repeated clashes with the Etruscans and Samnites, Rome realized that to survive, it had to organize. It couldn't just rely on the courage of part-time peasants. And so came the birth of the legions, a machine forged from discipline, hierarchy, and constant drilling. The man who shaped the early legions was Marcus Furius Camillus, a statesman and general sometimes called the second founder of Rome. After Rome was humiliated by the Gauls in 390 BCE, when the city was sacked and ransomed with gold, Camillus led the rebuilding effort, both literally and militarily. He pushed for reforms, better training, standardized weapons, and the introduction of the manipular formation, a flexible battle layout that let Roman soldiers maneuver in smaller groups rather than massive, unwieldy blocks. From this point on, being a Roman soldier wasn't just about swinging a sword. It was about becoming part of something bigger. The legion became a living creature, each man a cell in its muscular body, trained to move as one, fight as one, die as one. One of the early quirks of the Roman army was their obsession with shovels. Seriously, every legionary carried a shovel or pickaxe, and they used them constantly. At the end of every day's march, they built a fortified camp, ditches, walls, palisades, whether they were deep in enemy territory or just a few miles from Rome. No exceptions. Some historians argue whether this obsession with digging was overkill or genius, but either way, it made the legions nearly impossible to ambush at night. Then came the pilum, a throwing spear designed to bend on impact so enemies couldn't toss it back. Nothing says we've thought this through like building a weapon specifically to be useless after a single use. And don't get us started on Roman sandals. The caligae. These open-toed murder shoes had thick soles studded with iron hobnails, great for traction, terrifying on cobblestones, and utterly unforgiving to anyone walking behind you. But the real backbone of the army wasn't the weapons, it was the training. Recruits trained with wooden swords twice the weight of real ones. They marched endlessly, drilled relentlessly, and if they ever got lazy, decimation. Yes, decimation, as in line up 10 men and kill one of them as a warning. Not metaphorically, literally. The legions didn't tolerate failure, and they had no room for second chances. One of the earliest deployments of the new, disciplined Roman legions was against the Samnites, a fierce mountain people who had already handed Rome several embarrassing defeats. But this time, the legions were different. They were faster, smarter, more ruthless. They fought in tight coordination, using terrain and tactics, not just brute force. The Battle of Sentinum in 295 BCE is often marked as a turning point. Rome faced not just the Samnites, but a coalition of Etruscans, Gauls, and Umbrians. For armies, one field, and Rome won not easily but decisively. The maneuverability of the manipular formation and the sheer discipline of the legions turned the tide. That day, they didn't just win a battle. They proved that Roman warfare had matured, and it was terrifying. Of course, not everything was glorious. The legions still had growing pains. At times, they mutinied over pay, or loot, or just being marched too far without wine. There's one record of an entire unit refusing to fight until someone brought them goats. Goats. Historians still argue whether that story's literal or just a cheeky scribble in an otherwise serious scroll. Still, from those early clashes, a pattern emerged. Rome didn't just win through strength. It won through persistence. It learned from mistakes. It absorbed the tactics of enemies, improved upon them, and turned them into Roman trademarks. And when the dust settled, you could see it. A new kind of army. Not just warriors. Professionals. Not just a tool of defense, but a weapon of empire. That was the birth of the legions. The rest of the world had no idea what was coming. The hills of central Italy were alive with war cries. In the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, Rome was not yet a global empire. It was a scrappy regional power clawing its way up by trampling those who stood in its path. And among the fiercest of its early enemies were the Samnites, tribal warriors of the Apennine Mountains. They didn't dress like the Romans. No neat formations, no crested helmets or polished armor. Samnite warriors favored loose tunics, bright sashes, and wicked-looking javelins. They were fast, nimble, and masters of guerrilla warfare. To fight them was like chasing smoke through a rocky maze. The Romans, now organized into their prized legions, were confident. Some would say cocky. But the Samnites quickly wiped the smugness from their faces. One of the most humiliating defeats came at the Caudine Forks, around 321 BCE. Rome marched its legions into a mountain pass, only to find both exits blocked. No room to fight, no way to retreat. The Samnites didn't even kill them. They humiliated them. The entire Roman army was forced to surrender, lay down arms, and worst of all, march naked under a yoke of spears, a symbolic gesture of total disgrace. That moment burned into Roman memory like a branding iron. Even centuries later, senators would bring up the Caudine Forks in debate, as if to say, let's not screw up that badly again. But the Romans didn't sulk for long. They rebuilt, regrouped, and got very, very serious. The next encounters were far less humiliating for them, and far bloodier for the Samnites. By 305 BCE, during the Third Samnite War, Roman strategy had matured. They now excelled at building roads to move troops quickly, constructing camps overnight, and surrounding enemies with layered attacks. The once fluid Samnites found themselves penned in, forced to fight on Rome's terms. One of the key innovations in this period was combined arms, using different units in coordination. The light infantry, would harass the enemy, forcing them into range of the heavy legionaries. Cavalry would circle and flank, pinching the enemy into submission. Rome wasn't just swinging swords anymore, they were playing chess in real time. Still, the Samnites were no pushovers. They fought back with desperate fury. In one clash near Lochley, they nearly broke the Roman line by sheer ferocity. But reinforcements arrived just in time, and Roman discipline did the rest. As always, Rome bled, learned, and pushed forward. One of the more bizarre tactics recorded in this period was the use of mirrored shields. There's a fringe theory, beloved by some military history buffs, that a few Samnite units polished their bronze shields to such a shine, they could reflect sunlight into Roman eyes during battle. Most historians scoff, of course. A good stab in the gut beats clever lighting tricks, one scholar dryly noted. But hey, battlefield flair never hurt. Rome's slow, grinding conquest of Samnium taught the legions something priceless. That terrain can kill you just as fast as swords. The mountains weren't just obstacles, they were weapons. Every ambush, every muddy slope, every rockslide became part of the Samnite arsenal. So the Romans adapted. They trained for hill fighting. They assigned scouts more authority. They became students of the land. In the Battle of Bovianum in 305 BCE, Rome sealed the deal. Their victory was overwhelming, and soon after, Samnium was broken, at least politically. But culturally, spiritually, the Samnites would go on to rise again, even centuries later during Rome's civil wars. Like weeds in the cracks of empire, they never fully vanished. In the wake of their victory, Roman soldiers weren't just paid with coin. They were given land, chunks of conquered Samnite territory to farm and settle. This was Rome's secret weapon. Every soldier who survived became both a veteran and a settler. They planted Roman culture, Roman roads, Roman gods. The military and colonization were two arms of the same body. There was a dark irony to it all. Rome fought for survival, for pride, for vengeance, but in victory, it absorbed its enemies. Many Samnites later would serve in the Roman army. Others moved to Roman cities, intermarried, and vanished into the bloodstream of the Republic. The more Rome fought, the more it grew, not just in land but in identity. This pattern, resistance, conquest, absorption, would repeat again and again. But the Samnite Wars were the first true test. They forced Rome to evolve, to build smarter armies, more versatile strategies, and a hardened will that would later be thrown against much greater foes. Historians still argue whether the Samnites could have won had they united with more allies, or struck deeper into Roman territory during their brief dominance. But hindsight is a cozy chair for generals who never fought in mud up to their knees with arrows screaming overhead. What's clear is this: the Samnites made Rome bleed. And in doing so, they sharpened it. The rough draft of the legions became a polished, brutal instrument. Rome didn't just survive Samnium, it forged itself there. By the early 3rd century BCE, Rome had grown bolder, wealthier, and hungrier. Its wars had moved beyond the craggy hills of Italy into the broader world. And that's when they met Pyrrhus of Epirus, a man with a name like a sneeze and a habit of winning battles while losing everything else. Pyrrhus wasn't just any king. He was a distant cousin of Alexander the Great, raised on stories of unstoppable armies and world domination. When the Greek city of Tarentum in southern Italy called for help against Rome, Pyrrhus didn't just answer. He packed his bags, loaded his elephants, yes, elephants, and said something like, "Ah, finally. A proper war." Rome had never fought elephants before. They didn't even know how to pronounce the word for it. When Pyrrhus landed in Italy with 20,000 infantry, 3,000 cavalry, and a handful of war elephants, Roman generals reportedly thought they were some kind of hairy hill monsters. One legionary allegedly said, "Do we stab it or set it on fire?" Classic. At the Battle of Heraclea in 280 BCE, Pyrrhus got his first taste of Roman steel, and the Romans got their first taste of what it meant to fight a professional Hellenistic army. Pyrrhus's troops used phalanx formations, long sarissas, and precise maneuvers that caught the Romans off guard. Then came the elephants, stomping through ranks, causing horses to bolt and men to scream. And yet, the Romans didn't break. They fell back, regrouped, and kept fighting. Pyrrhus won barely, but at a tremendous cost. Thousands of his men lay dead. His officers warned him, another victory like that and they'd be ruined. And that's where the term Pyrrhic victory was born. A win so costly, it might as well be a loss. The Romans, naturally, didn't care much for terminology. They just saw an enemy who could bleed. So they called up more legions, marched again, and met Pyrrhus at the Battle of Asculum the following year. This time, Rome came prepared. They spread their ranks, avoided tight formations vulnerable to elephants, and even used wagons loaded with spikes and fire to spook the beasts. It was brutal, messy, and loud. Pyrrhus won again, but just barely. Some sources say he lost more men than the Romans. One Roman soldier even managed to kill an elephant handler and hijack the elephant mid-battle, basically inventing ancient tank-jacking. Historians still argue whether Pyrrhus's campaign could have succeeded if he'd pushed toward Rome directly. Instead, he zigzagged through southern Italy, seeking new allies, overstretching his supply lines, and watching his mercenaries desert for better-paying gigs. Eventually, he left Italy entirely and tried his luck in Sicily. Because nothing says, "I'm losing," like changing continents. The Romans, meanwhile, just tightened their grip, retook lost cities, and slowly erased any trace of Epirus' influence. By 275 BCE, Pyrrhus returned to Italy for one final throw of the dice, the Battle of Beneventum. This time, Rome was more than ready. The elephants were blocked before they could even charge. Roman archers peppered them from a distance, and the disciplined legions carved through the disorganized Greek ranks like a buzzsaw through baklava. Pyrrhus limped back to Greece, broke, bitter, and bruised. According to one account, he later died in a street brawl after being hit on the head by a roof tile thrown by an old woman. Epic way to go. But what mattered most was the message. Rome could now stand against the finest armies in the Mediterranean. They had learned how to counter phalanxes, how to neutralize war elephants, how to take a beating and come back stronger the next year. Their army wasn't just tough, it was adaptable. And Pyrrhus, despite being a capable general, had stumbled into Rome's favorite trap, attrition. He might have been smarter on the battlefield, but Rome played the long game. As one senator reportedly said, "We don't need better generals. We just need more Romans." One curious side note from this period: several Roman soldiers reportedly adopted bits of Greek style after these wars. Some started wearing short red cloaks like Macedonian officers. Others took to using Greek nicknames. It's one of those strange cross-cultural backflows that happens even in wartime. "We hate you," the Romans might have said. "But that spear technique? Pretty solid." Rome would later use those exact same tactics, elephants included, against other enemies. They were collectors of techniques, borrowers of brilliance. Every defeat was a lesson. Every setback, a stepping stone. And when the dust settled, Epirus was gone. Tarentum had surrendered. Southern Italy belonged to Rome. Pyrrhus had returned home with nothing but memories and a bill he couldn't pay. Rome, on the other hand, had gained something priceless: proof that it could take on the Greek world and win. The Republic had tested itself against a foreign king with a pedigree of conquest, and survived. Next up, a city across the sea. Richer, older, infinitely more dangerous. Carthage was waiting. The ships creaked as they bobbed on the blue-black waves of the Mediterranean. Roman legionaries, more used to marching dusty roads than sailing foreign seas, clutched at their gear and stared out at the horizon. Ahead lay the glittering coast of Africa, and beyond it, the jewel of Rome's next war, Carthage. By the time of the First Punic War, 264 to 241 BCE, Carthage wasn't just a rival, it was a superpower. Founded by Phoenician settlers, Carthage had become a mercantile empire, rich from trade, guarded by powerful fleets, and ruled by a council that treated war as business. Rome controlled Italy, Carthage controlled the sea, and both wanted Sicily. What began as a local squabble over a Sicilian city quickly spiraled into a titanic struggle between two empires. Rome, for all its might on land, had no navy worth bragging about. Carthage, on the other hand, had hundreds of sleek warships and centuries of experience at sea. It was like pitting a trireme against a tricycle. But Rome doesn't accept disadvantages, they weaponize them. When they captured a wrecked Carthaginian warship, Roman engineers allegedly reverse-engineered it plank by plank. Within a year, they had built an entire fleet from scratch. No kidding. Full navy. Like students cramming the night before a test, the Romans figured it out as they went. Their key innovation: the corvus, a kind of boarding bridge with a spike that slammed down onto enemy ships, turning naval battles into boarding fights. Think of it as Rome yelling, "Oh, we're bad at sailing? Fine. Let's make it a land battle on boats." The plan was effective, if a little chaotic. Early Roman sailors were so inexperienced that many ships capsized in storms. One particularly bad squall killed over 100,000 men, not in battle but just from bad weather and worse navigation. Still, Rome refused to stop. Meanwhile, Carthage relied on its seasoned commanders and hired armies. Their troops came from Spain, Gaul, Numidia, even Greece. But while they fought well, they lacked Rome's sense of national purpose. Roman soldiers bled for their republic. Carthaginian mercenaries bled for their paycheck, and might walk away if it got too messy. The Battle of Mylae in 260 BCE was Rome's first true naval victory. The corvus worked beautifully. Roman marines swarmed enemy decks and turned the fight into a brawl, where they thrived. One Roman commander, Gaius Duilius, even had a column built in his honor, with carvings of ship beaks and an inscription bragging that he walked home from battle lit by torchbearers. Humble wasn't exactly a Roman trait. But it wasn't just at sea where Rome proved itself. They also landed troops in North Africa, led by Marcus Atilius Regulus, who won several early victories and even got within sight of Carthage's walls. The locals panicked. Elephants were summoned. Reinforcements from Greece were hired. And when Regulus refused a peace offer, he was crushed at the Battle of Bagradas. His army obliterated, he was captured, and Carthage briefly breathed easier. There's a famous, and still debated, story that Regulus was sent back to Rome on parole to negotiate a prisoner exchange. Instead, he told the Senate to refuse. He insisted Rome should not trade Carthaginian prisoners, even though it meant his death. Then, like some tragic marble statue, he returned to Carthage and was allegedly executed, possibly by being locked in a barrel lined with spikes. Historians still argue whether this story is truth or Roman propaganda. Either way, it lit a fire under the Roman people. Back in Sicily, the war dragged on for years. Towns changed hands. Supplies ran dry. Horses were eaten. At one point, both sides literally ran out of money, and soldiers were paid in salt and IOUs. Still, Rome refused to yield. They rebuilt fleet after fleet, 7 in total, after devastating losses. By the time of the Battle of the Aegates Islands in 241 BCE, Rome had mastered sea combat. Their ships were faster, their tactics sharper. They cut off Carthage's resupply lines and forced them to the negotiation table. Carthage, bled dry and politically divided, surrendered. They gave up Sicily, paid a huge indemnity, and watched Rome walk away victorious. But that wasn't the end. It wasn't even the halfway point, because Carthage had a boy who watched the treaty being signed, a boy who, legend says, swore eternal hatred of Rome, Hannibal. And 20 years later, that boy would lead elephants over the Alps, into the very heart of Italy. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. For now, Rome had claimed Sicily, its first province outside the Italian peninsula. Its soldiers had tasted African sand. Its navy had grown from nothing into a force that could stand toe-to-toe with Carthage. And its people had learned something dangerous. They liked empire. The forest was quiet, too quiet. The marching columns moved with rhythmic certainty, armor clinking softly, standards held high. 3 entire Roman legions, nearly 20,000 men, made their way through the damp and misty woods of Germania. They were led by a trusted guide, a man fluent in Latin, trained in Roman tactics, and loyal to the empire. Or so they thought. This wasn't a traditional battlefield. There were no clear lines, no open fields, just endless trees, choking fog, and the distant creak of something not quite natural. It was 9 CE, and Rome was about to suffer one of its worst and most infamous defeats in history, the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. The legions had been dispatched to pacify the Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine. The region was wild, unconquered, and frustrating. Roman governors had tried to plant cities there, introduce Roman customs, and civilize the so-called barbarians. And it had seemed to be working until it didn't. The man leading this particular expedition was Publius Quinctilius Varus, a noble, experienced, and, most importantly, complacent general. He trusted his local advisor, a Germanic noble named Arminius, who had served in the Roman army and risen through the ranks. Arminius knew everything about Roman strategy. More than that, he knew how to exploit it. As the army pushed deeper into the forest, the terrain narrowed, the weather worsened, and the columns stretched thin. Roads turned to muddy trails, supply wagons bogged down, and visibility dropped to nearly nothing. Then came the ambush. From behind trees, under brush, and even above the cliffs, Germanic warriors burst forth. Armed with spears, axes, and a hatred nurtured for generations, they tore into the Roman flanks with savage precision. Trapped between ravines and dense woods, the Romans couldn't form their precious battle lines. Shields became useless. Formations collapsed. Officers shouted into the wind. The attack didn't last an hour, it lasted days. Each time the legions tried to regroup, Arminius led another wave. When they built a makeshift camp, it was overrun. When they retreated, the trees closed around them like a coffin. Rain turned the soil to sludge. Arrows whistled through the fog. On the third day, Varus, desperate, wounded, and likely despairing, fell on his own sword. Of the roughly 20,000 Roman troops who entered the Teutoburg forest, almost none survived. A few cavalry officers fled through the trees. The rest were slaughtered, captured, or sacrificed in grim rituals. Arminius's forces allegedly nailed Roman heads to trees, scattered eagle standards in the mud, and offered severed hands to their gods. When news reached Rome, Emperor Augustus was said to have torn his clothes and screamed, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions!" The loss of the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions was such a scar on the Roman psyche that their numbers were never used again in the Roman army. Ever. Historians still argue whether the defeat was due to Varus's arrogance, Rome's overreach, or simply Arminius's cunning. Perhaps it was all three. But one thing was certain. The Teutoburg forest changed everything. Rome would never again try to conquer Germania beyond the Rhine. The river became a hard border. Instead of expansion, the empire focused on defense, building forts, walls, and watchtowers. The myth of Rome's invincibility had been shattered by a forest. In the years that followed, Roman generals did return. Germanicus, the adopted son of Emperor Tiberius, led punitive campaigns into Germania, recovering 2 of the lost eagle standards and burning enemy villages. In one eerie episode, he and his men discovered the old battlefield. Bones still littered the ground. Rusted weapons poked from the mud. Skeletons of men and horses, still in ranks, stared silently into the sky. They gathered the remains, buried their comrades, and prayed to the gods of war and death. But even Germanicus, despite his victories, did not attempt full conquest. The trauma ran too deep. There was a curious postscript to Arminius's story. After defeating Rome, he didn't become king of Germania. Instead, tribal rivalries returned. Power struggles fractured alliances. Arminius was assassinated by his own people, a stark reminder that even great liberators are rarely immune to local politics. The Teutoburg disaster had a chilling effect on Roman ambition. From then on, generals would think twice before marching legions into unfamiliar forests. The empire learned a cruel lesson. Not all land is conquerable, and not all enemies fight fair. But in true Roman fashion, they turned defeat into adaptation. Fortifications grew stronger. Scouting improved. Auxiliaries, local soldiers familiar with wild terrain, were used more often. Rome wouldn't walk blindly into another trap. Not if they could help it. Still, the ghosts of Teutoburg lingered. In Roman texts, the forest was described with horror, Saltus Teutoburgiensis, a place of darkness and betrayal. Poets called it cursed. Officers used it as a warning for new recruits. Parents, perhaps, whispered it at night to keep restless children in bed. "Don't stray too far into the woods," they might say. That's where Rome forgot who it was. The hilltop fortress rose out of the Gallic landscape like a stone crown, encircled by thick walls, bristling with defenders, and pulsing with the desperate resolve of a trapped people. This was Alesia, stronghold of the Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix, and at its base sprawled the grinding, almost surgical machinery of Roman conquest. The year was 52 BCE, and Julius Caesar, then governor of Gaul, had spent years subjugating tribes, building roads, cutting down forests, and making enemies faster than temples could be raised in his honor. But Vercingetorix was no ordinary opponent. He was charismatic, battle-hardened, and, most importantly, unified the fiercely independent Gallic tribes into one cause: resistance. Alesia was the culmination of this war. Vercingetorix had retreated to the fortified hill town, believing the elevated position and massive walls would give him time for reinforcements to arrive. He underestimated Caesar. Most people did until they didn't. Instead of charging the fortress, Caesar built a wall around it. Then he built another wall facing outward. The result was a double ring of fortifications, one to keep the defenders in, one to keep their rescuers out. 21 miles of trenchwork, towers, ditches, and stakes. It was part engineering marvel, part psychological warfare. Even the Gauls inside must have stared down at it and whispered, "What is he doing?" But Caesar's method was brutal brilliance. He turned the siege into a slow choke. The Gauls inside Alesia began to starve. They sent their non-combatants, women, children, elderly, out of the gates, hoping the Romans would take them as prisoners or let them go. Instead, Caesar left them in the no-man's land between the walls, neither allowed to return nor accepted by Rome. They died slowly, visibly. It wasn't just a siege. It was a message. Then came the reinforcements, an estimated 60,000 Gauls crashing into Caesar's outer fortifications. They attacked with wild energy, hurling themselves at Roman defenses. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix led a synchronized breakout. Caesar's army, already stretched thin, was surrounded, attacked from both inside and out, and yet, they held. Caesar galloped between weak points on horseback, personally commanding reinforcements. Roman slingers and archers cut down charging waves. Cavalry outflanked flanking maneuvers. In a critical moment, Germanic horsemen allied with Rome surged into the Gauls' rear lines, scattering them. The relief army collapsed. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix saw the writing on the wall. He surrendered. Not with drama, not with curses. He simply rode out of the gates, removed his armor, and knelt silently before Caesar. Some say he did so in full ceremonial dress, a calculated moment of dignity amid defeat. Others claim he was dragged in chains. Historians still argue about which version is true, but in both accounts, Rome had won. The victory at Alesia was more than tactical. It was political theater. It broke Gallic resistance. Tribe after tribe capitulated. Caesar returned to Rome not just as a general, but as a legend. His Commentarii de Bello Gallico, his own account of the war, spun the entire campaign into a glowing narrative of order triumphing over barbarism. Of course, the truth was messier. Alesia exposed the cracks in Roman strategy. Overstretched supply lines, overworked soldiers, rising unrest back home. The legions had won, but they were weary. Some veterans had marched for over 5 years without seeing Italy. And Caesar? He wasn't just fighting Gauls. He was preparing for the civil war to come. There's a quirky footnote from the Alesia campaign. Caesar reportedly ordered caltrops, small iron devices with spikes, that would always land point up when scattered on the ground. They were used to cripple charging horses and confuse enemies during retreats. Simple, painful, effective. Kind of like the campaign itself. Alesia also demonstrated the value of siege warfare, not just for conquest, but for containment and humiliation. Instead of breaking walls, Caesar had broken morale. Instead of charging, he had waited. The legions had learned to let time do the bleeding. And while Vercingetorix spent the next 5 years rotting in a Roman prison, paraded through the streets in Caesar's triumph, and eventually executed in some forgotten corner of the Tullianum, his spirit never quite died. In fact, during the 19th century, Napoleon himself would resurrect Vercingetorix as a symbol of French nationalism. Proof that even centuries after defeat, legends still breathe. As for the legions, they left Alesia not as conquerors of a town, but as architects of an empire. Gaul was no longer a collection of tribes. It was Roman now. Roads stretched from Paris to the Pyrenees. Latin seeped into the soil. The wine got better. The taxes got worse. And somewhere beneath it all, in the dirt under Alesia, the bones of the fallen lay still. Rome had won again, but the next war, it would come not from a fortress, but from a throne wrapped in gold and cobra crowns. Egypt was calling. The sails of the Roman fleet billowed as they crossed the shimmering blue of the Mediterranean, drawn southward by rumors of treasure, beauty, and unrest. Their destination, Egypt, a land older than myth, where the gods had animal heads, the rivers flooded on schedule, and the throne was claimed by a woman who knew exactly how to weaponize seduction, strategy, and spectacle. Cleopatra VII wasn't just a queen. She was a phenomenon. Fluent in a dozen languages, trained in mathematics, philosophy, and politics, she ruled a nation wrapped in ancient splendor and riddled with internal decay. Egypt, nominally independent, was heavily entangled with Roman economics. And in the chaos following Caesar's rise and assassination, it became clear, Whoever controlled Egypt controlled the grain, and possibly the fate of the empire. But let's rewind a bit. In 48 BCE, Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria, hot on the heels of his rival Pompey. What he found was a palace dripping with intrigue. The Ptolemaic dynasty, descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals, had been waging a civil war between Cleopatra and her brother-husband, Ptolemy XIII. Things had gotten messy. Cleopatra had been ousted but wasn't out. So what did she do? She smuggled herself into Caesar's presence rolled up in a rug. At least, that's the version favored by Roman writers who loved a good visual. More likely, it was a linen sack. Either way, it worked. She made her pitch, made her case. And maybe more. Caesar sided with Cleopatra. Within days, Roman troops were fighting Egyptians in the streets of Alexandria. The famed Library of Alexandria may have burned during this conflict, though historians still argue whether that particular tragedy happened then or later or at all. Eventually, Ptolemy XIII drowned trying to flee across the Nile. Cleopatra regained her throne, with Caesar's backing, and Rome's legions dug in to support the new regime. For the soldiers, Egypt was a dream and a nightmare. The heat was punishing, the insects unforgiving, and yet, the wealth, the architecture, the sheer alien splendor of the place dazzled even the most hardened legionary. Temples taller than any basilica back home, obelisks covered in unreadable symbols, and the Nile, a river that seemed to control life itself, rising and falling like the breath of some enormous, invisible beast. It wasn't all pharaohs and festivals, though. Caesar stayed longer than expected. Rome grew restless, and Cleopatra gave birth to a son, Caesarion, claiming him as Julius Caesar's child. That was politically awkward. When Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March, Cleopatra returned to Egypt, power secured but future uncertain, and Rome descended into chaos once again. Enter Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal friend, general, and eventual member of the Second Triumvirate. When he met Cleopatra, the sparks didn't just fly, they burned down entire plans. Antony fell for her with a ferocity that scandalized Rome. He moved into her palace, drank her wine, wore her silks, and held court in a world of perfumes, music, and politics bathed in candlelight. But Antony wasn't just lounging around. He brought legions with him, Roman soldiers now guarding Egyptian interests. In return, Cleopatra supplied grain, ships, and coin. Their partnership, personal and political, shook the Republic. Meanwhile, back in Rome, Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, watched all of this with a calculated calm. He painted Antony as a man bewitched, a Roman who had gone native, a lover of excess, a traitor to tradition. The Senate, increasingly uncomfortable with the idea of Antony ruling from Alexandria alongside a foreign queen, took the bait. War was inevitable. Before the final confrontation, Antony declared Caesarion Caesar's rightful heir, dismissed his Roman wife, Octavian's sister, awkward, and gave away Roman territories to Cleopatra's children. Octavian had all the propaganda he needed. With the Senate's blessing, he marched to war. Legions assembled, fleets launched, and in 31 BCE, off the coast of western Greece, the two powers met in one of history's most pivotal naval battles, Actium. But we'll save that for later. Back in Egypt, life for Roman soldiers was strange. Some married locals, learned Coptic phrases, and shaved their heads to cope with the heat. Others wrote back home about crocodiles as long as wagons, or about lotus flowers and the eerie silence of the desert at night. One officer recorded seeing priests enter pyramids without returning by the same path. Likely just a clever architectural trick, but enough to earn Egypt a reputation as a land of mystery and magic. And perhaps most bizarre of all, Cleopatra's court employed Greek philosophers, Egyptian magicians, and Roman engineers, all under one roof. One account describes a dinner party where mechanical birds sang above the table, while the guests debated astrology and politics over wine laced with date syrup. This blend of cultures, this strange alchemy of East and West, is what made Egypt so intoxicating and so threatening to Roman conservatives. The legions had marched into many lands before, but none so ancient, so opulent, or so willing to reshape Rome in return. In Egypt, the legions weren't just conquering. They were being transformed. The waves lapped softly against the hulls of hundreds of ships. On the deck of a Roman trireme, a legionary adjusted his armor in the morning haze, the smell of salt and oil thick in the air. Around him, sailors shouted orders, archers prepped flaming arrows, and the horizon shimmered with sails. So many sails they looked like wings unfolding over the sea. This was Actium 31 BCE, the showdown that would decide the fate of Rome. On one side, Mark Antony and Cleopatra, rulers of the eastern provinces and defenders of a world shaped by Greek elegance and Egyptian wealth. On the other, Octavian, young, calculating, and backed by a Roman Senate tired of foreign queens and flamboyant generals with too much eyeliner. Let's be honest, this wasn't just a war of tactics. It was a PR battle. Octavian had already begun reshaping the narrative. He wasn't just fighting Antony, he was saving Rome from seduction, from corruption, from Egypt. He played the part of the stoic, dutiful Roman, while his rival was painted as a love-struck traitor floating down the Nile on a golden barge. But while Octavian spun the story, his top general, Marcus Agrippa, prepared the fleet. Agrippa, unlike most politicians, actually knew naval warfare. He cut off Antony's supply lines, took key island bases, and boxed Antony's ships into the Bay of Actium like a trap closing slowly, inexorably. On the morning of battle, Antony's fleet, large, heavy, and built for ramming, faced off against Agrippa's smaller, more agile ships. Cleopatra's own vessels were nearby, sleek and exotic, their sails painted and golden. Legend says she watched from a gilded galley, eyes on the horizon, waiting for the moment to strike or flee. The clash began with flaming arrows, catapult shots, and the groan of timber on timber. Roman marines, trained to leap between decks and fight like it was solid ground, swarmed enemy ships. Antony's men tried to hold formation, but his command structure was fraying. Some of his allies had already deserted. Morale was shaky, discipline worse. Then came the moment that changed history. Cleopatra's fleet, stationed behind Antony's, suddenly turned and fled. Historians still debate her motives. Was it a prearranged escape plan? A last-minute decision to save what she could? A clever trick to draw away pursuers? Whatever the reason, Antony, seeing her ships retreat, abandoned the fight and followed. His troops, left leaderless, panicked. Without direction, many surrendered. Others fought to the death. A few set their own ships on fire rather than be captured. The water turned black with smoke, red with blood, and thick with wreckage. It was, in every sense, a disaster for Antony. Back in Egypt, the fleeing lovers regrouped. For a moment, it seemed they might rally. Antony even tried to prepare for a final stand. But desertions increased. Friends vanished. Support in the east evaporated. And in 30 BCE, Octavian's legions arrived at the gates of Alexandria. This wasn't a battle. It was a quiet collapse. Antony, humiliated and broken, fell on his sword, but botched the job. Dying slowly, painfully, he was carried to Cleopatra, who held him as he bled out. Moments that sound romantic in Latin tend to be considerably messier in real life. Cleopatra, seeing her options dwindle, tried negotiation. She reportedly attempted to charm Octavian, but he wasn't Antony. He saw her not as a queen, but as a political liability. And so, rather than become a trophy in his triumph parade, Cleopatra chose her own end. The snake story? Iconic but possibly false. The asp in a basket tale might be Roman propaganda, a little too poetic to be true. Some historians believe she used poison smuggled in a hairpin. Others think she simply drank something lethal. Either way, she died on her terms. Her son, Caesarion, was hunted down and killed shortly after. Octavian had no interest in rival heirs to Julius Caesar. With Egypt subdued, the legions didn't just occupy. They absorbed. The Ptolemaic dynasty ended. The temples, pyramids, and palaces now served a new master. Egypt became a Roman province, its grain flowing north to feed the empire. Alexandria remained a hub of culture and learning, but with Roman standards flying overhead. The soldiers stationed there quickly adapted. Papyrus scrolls began including Latin inscriptions. Roman bathhouses appeared near old Nile docks. You could buy Roman olive oil next to baskets of lotus roots in the same market. Egypt had become Roman, but Rome, in small ways, also became a little Egyptian. Interestingly, Roman commanders took a liking to Egyptian calendar systems, which were more accurate than the old Roman lunar mess. The result? The Julian calendar, Caesar's legacy of scheduling, which shaped the very rhythm of Western civilization for centuries. And then there were the cats. Roman soldiers sent home carvings of Batet statues and trinkets of feline-headed gods. One centurion even kept a mummified kitten as a good luck charm. Yes, really, the fall of Antony and Cleopatra marked more than just the end of a civil war. It was the end of the Roman Republic. Octavian returned to Rome with unmatched power, declared peace, and quietly consolidated authority. He became Augustus, Rome's first emperor. The legions, once tools of the Senate, were now instruments of imperial will. And their next campaign? Not conquest, but control. The trumpets blare at dawn. Rows of legionaries snap to attention under the desert sun, their armor gleaming, red tunics catching the breeze like fluttering blood. But there is no war today, no conquest, no siege. These men aren't marching east or sailing west. They're standing guard over borders. Because the empire is full now. Under Augustus, Rome wasn't expanding as much as it was consolidating. The provinces stretched from the moors of Britain to the sands of Syria, and from the snowy forests of Germania to the lush valleys of Egypt. The legion's job had changed, from conquerors to caretakers. But caretaker didn't mean soft. One of the most ambitious efforts of this era was the creation of limes Romanus, a sprawling system of fortifications, watchtowers, forts, and walls marking the edge of Roman territory. The most famous of these would eventually be Hadrian's Wall in Britain, but it started here on the turbulent borders of the Danube and Rhine. These frontiers were breathing things, not solid lines but zones of tension. Raiders tested them, diplomats negotiated across them, traders moved through them, and the legions? They became the face of Rome, not to enemies on battlefields, but to farmers, villagers, and tribal chieftains. They didn't just carry swords, they carried law. A Roman outpost brought order, roads, aqueducts, and tax collectors. In some towns, the legionary camp was the city. Soldiers bought local produce, married local women, and filled taverns with songs from places thousands of miles away. It was the world's most armed melting pot. Of course, not everything was peaceful. One of the most volatile regions was the Balkans, where various tribes resisted Roman control. One rebellion, led by the Pannonians and Dalmatians, erupted in 6 CE and nearly unraveled the eastern provinces. The so-called Great Illyrian Revolt lasted for 3 brutal years, tying up 10 legions, nearly a third of the entire Roman military. The rebellion was fueled by grievances, land seizures, heavy taxes, and the arrogant behavior of Roman officials. Sound familiar? Some things never change. Eventually, Rome crushed the uprising through sheer numbers, fortified its presence in the region, and learned an expensive lesson. Even in peace, occupation requires vigilance. Meanwhile, in Judea, recently made a Roman province, the situation was simmering. The region had long been ruled by client kings, most famously Herod the Great, who built grand cities and temples but kept the people on edge. When his dynasty faltered, Rome stepped in directly. The local population, deeply religious and proudly independent, bristled under foreign rule. Roman soldiers patrolled the streets of Jerusalem, often clashing with locals. Stories circulated of soldiers disrespecting holy sites, mocking Jewish customs, and extorting merchants. A fringe debate among historians asks, did Roman presence actually encourage religious radicalism, or was that powder keg going to blow no matter what? The legions in Judea, many of them hardened veterans from other provinces, found themselves policing temples instead of storming them. But every now and then, they'd face a flare-up. Riots, stabbings, ambushes in the hills. These weren't formal battles but insurgencies, and they tested Roman patience. In one particularly strange incident, a self-proclaimed prophet led a group of followers into the desert, claiming the Jordan River would part for them like it had for Moses. Didn't. But the Roman governor didn't wait to find out. He sent in cavalry, and the movement ended in blood and sand. Amid all this, the empire kept building. Roads stretched farther, garrisons were upgraded, and veteran colonies were founded in far-off lands. These settlements were both reward and strategy. Retired soldiers got land, and Rome got loyal outposts. It wasn't just men Rome exported, it was identity. A legion camp wasn't just barracks. It had a forum, baths, temples, and theaters. Latin inscriptions appeared on stone altars in places where, a generation earlier, no one even wore shoes. A Gallic blacksmith might pray to Mars. A Syrian farmer might quote Virgil. But beneath the calm, cracks widened. Corruption crept into provincial administration. Taxation became crushing. And the legions, now long-term residents of these distant lands, began to identify more with their commanders than with Rome itself. Loyalty, once to the Republic, then to the emperor, now leaned toward whoever paid salaries and promised land. And the emperors? They were getting nervous. To tighten control, Augustus passed laws restricting generals from holding too many troops for too long. He rotated commands. He spied on governors. But even the most clever emperor can't be everywhere at once. One of the quirks of this era was the appearance of legion tattoos, not the stylish kind, but brands, burned onto the forearms of recruits with the unit number and eagle emblem. A way to discourage desertion and enforce identity. You're not just a man, it said. You're property of Rome. Peace was expensive. It needed to be built, guarded, and occasionally burned into flesh. The empire was at its widest. The Mediterranean was a Roman lake. Roads crisscrossed continents. And yet, in the barracks of Dacia, or the hills of Syria, a soldier might stare toward the horizon and wonder, what's on the other side? And eventually, someone would decide to find out. Snow crunches beneath your boots as you trudge north. Too far north, honestly. The wind bites through your cloak. Frost gathers on your helmet. Somewhere behind you, campfires flicker in the darkness, and the scent of roasted barley and mutton hangs in the air. But ahead, past the hills and the watchtowers, lies the edge of the known world. This is Britannia, and Rome wants it. When Emperor Claudius decided in 43 CE to launch a full-scale invasion of Britain, many thought he was overreaching. The island was wild, foggy, and filled with tribes who wore blue paint and had a fondness for ambushing from behind trees. Previous Roman attempts to invade, like Julius Caesar's quick forays a century earlier, had been more for bragging rights than actual colonization. But Claudius, a man often mocked for his stammer and limp, was out to prove himself. And nothing says, "I'm in charge now," like planting eagles in a foreign land. The Roman legions landed on the southern shores and immediately went to work. Roads were cut through forests, fortresses sprang up like mushrooms after rain, and tribal leaders were offered a familiar choice. Surrender and keep your shiny necklaces, or resist and get flattened. Some chose wisely. Others, like Caratacus, did not. Caratacus was a warrior chieftain who resisted Rome for nearly a decade, using the terrain and guerrilla tactics to harass supply lines and ambush patrols. He was eventually betrayed and brought to Rome in chains. But here's the twist. Instead of begging for mercy, he gave such a bold, defiant speech before the Senate that Emperor Claudius pardoned him on the spot. It was a power move on both sides. Caratacus kept his pride, and Claudius showed magnanimity. But if Rome expected things to calm down after that, they were hilariously wrong. Because then came Boudica. She was the widow of a tribal king who had ruled in cooperation with Rome. When he died, the Romans annexed his land, flogged Boudica, and, trigger warning for ancient cruelty, assaulted her daughters. This was not a good idea. In 60 or 61 CE, Boudica rallied a massive force of Britons and launched one of the most devastating uprisings in Roman provincial history. Her warriors burned Camuloginum, modern Colchester, wiped out the Roman 9th Legion, and torched Londinium, yes, that's London, to cinders. Romans fled. Governors panicked. For a moment it looked like Britannia might slip away. But then the Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus regrouped with a smaller, disciplined force. Using tight formations and superior armor, the legions stood firm against a much larger but less organized Briton army. Boudica was defeated in a final pitched battle, location still debated, and died shortly after. Some say she took poison to avoid capture. Others claim she died of illness. The story varies depending on which Roman was writing it. In the aftermath, Rome tightened its grip. New forts were built, new roads carved, cities rebuilt. But there was also a shift in tone, less conquest, more coexistence. The Roman strategy became accommodation. Local elites were Romanized, offered citizenship, and even invited to govern their own towns, as long as taxes were paid and rebellions were kept to a polite minimum. Still, the north remained a thorn in Rome's side. The tribes of Caledonia, modern Scotland, refused to be tamed. In 122 CE, Emperor Hadrian ordered the construction of a wall, Hadrian's Wall, to mark the official northern boundary. It stretched nearly 80 miles coast to coast, complete with towers, mile castles, and gates. Think of it as a heavily militarized version of a picket fence, with the not-so-subtle message, Rome ends here. Funny tidbit: Hadrian's Wall wasn't just a military barrier. It also functioned as a customs checkpoint. People could still pass through, if they paid tolls and didn't look too stabby. Legionaries posted along the wall developed a unique lifestyle. They hunted in nearby forests, traded with local tribes, sometimes unofficially, and practiced religions from all over the empire. Altars to Jupiter, Mithras, and local deities with lots of antlers have all been found near Roman outposts in the north. The further you got from Rome, the weirder it got. One Roman outpost even had a bathhouse with graffiti comparing legionaries to sheep. Another contained a tablet from a soldier requesting extra socks and underwear, because the Britons don't wear them. Priorities. Despite the challenges, Roman Britain thrived. Cities like Bath, York, and London became bustling hubs with temples, amphitheaters, and villas equipped with central heating. Latin mingled with Celtic dialects. Toga parties happened in towns where Druids once danced. But it was always a balancing act. Rebellion was never far. And the northern tribes? They didn't go anywhere. They just waited. The legions, for now, held the line. But Rome wasn't finished with distant ambitions. Because beyond the eastern deserts, beyond the Tigris and Euphrates, loomed the one rival Rome could never truly defeat: Parthia. And the legions were about to learn what it meant to chase glory and lose everything. The sun glares down on the flat, open plain. There's no shade, no water, just dust and tension. In the distance, a cloud rises, tiny at first, then growing, darkening, shimmering with movement. It's not a storm. It's Parthian cavalry, thousands of them. And you, a Roman legionary, stand in rigid formation, shield braced, staring into a nightmare. This is Carrie, 53 BCE. And Rome is about to suffer one of its most humiliating defeats. The man responsible, Marcus Licinius Crassus, 1/3 of the first triumvirate with Caesar and Pompey, and the richest man in Rome. Crassus had money, but not respect. He wanted military glory to match his fortune, and Parthia, the powerful empire to the east, seemed like the perfect target. It was rich, exotic, and, more importantly, not currently at war with Rome. That didn't stop Crassus. He raised an army of around 40,000 men, mostly heavy infantry, and marched into Parthian territory with the confidence of a man who had never lost a battle, because he'd barely fought any. Parthia was different from the enemies Rome usually faced. Their strength wasn't in legions or walls. It was in horse archers, lightning-fast cavalry that could ride in, fire volleys of arrows, and vanish before a counterattack. And at Carrhae they brought their best. The Roman formation looked intimidating. Blocky cohorts, rows of shields, artillery wagons behind. But the Parthians didn't play by those rules. They surrounded Crassus's force and began raining arrows from all directions. The Romans held their ground, shields locked into testudo formations. But the arrows kept coming. Hour after hour, day after day. Here's where it gets cruel. The Parthians used composite bows, short, curved weapons powerful enough to pierce Roman armor, and camel caravans loaded with spare arrows, allowing them to reload indefinitely. And then came the cataphracts. Heavy cavalry, fully armored, charging with lances like mobile battering rams. They'd smash into the Roman lines, then peel away before infantry could react. Crassus tried to negotiate a retreat. His officers urged caution. His son, Publius, led a cavalry detachment to try and flank the enemy. He was surrounded, trapped, and killed. The Parthians reportedly cut off his head and used it as a psychological weapon, parading it in view of the Roman lines. Crassus finally agreed to peace talks, but it was a trap. He and his officers were killed during the parley. Some say beheaded, others say molten gold was poured down Crassus's throat as poetic justice for his greed. Historians still argue about the details, but the result was clear. Rome had lost 20,000 men, and 10,000 more were captured. Parthia didn't march on Rome. That wasn't their goal. They just wanted to keep their borders secure and humiliate the arrogant foreigner who thought conquest would be easy. The captured Romans were marched east, some reportedly resettled near the Chinese frontier, in villages that may have retained Roman-style formations in battle. That's right. There's a fringe theory still hotly debated that Roman POWs ended up fighting for the Han dynasty. Wild, right? Back in Rome, the loss sent shockwaves. Crassus's death destabilized the triumvirate. His absence left Caesar and Pompey locked in a rivalry that would soon explode into civil war. Carry wasn't just a defeat. It was a turning point, and Rome never really got over Parthia. Over the next 2 centuries, emperors would launch campaigns against the Parthians over and over again: Trajan, Lucius Verus, Septimius Severus, each trying to avenge Carry or expand Rome's influence. Sometimes they captured cities like Ctesiphon, Parthia's capital, but they could never hold it. The terrain, the heat, the sheer distance from Roman supply lines, it was like trying to conquer a mirage. The Parthians, for their part, were experts in defense. They never needed to win battles, they just had to avoid being absorbed. Their decentralized structure, mobility, and battlefield discipline made them slippery. It wasn't glamorous, but it was effective. Eventually, Parthia gave way to the Sasanian Empire, a fiercer, more centralized Persian power that would go toe-to-toe with Rome for centuries. The frontier between Rome and Persia became a boiling line of forts, spies, and border skirmishes. It's worth noting that despite all this conflict, trade flourished. The Silk Road passed through Parthian territory, and Roman elites eagerly bought silks, spices, and exotic goods. So, while legions clashed with cataphracts, Roman senators were sipping Parthian wine and draping their wives in imported fabrics. And yes, some of those same senators denounced Parthian culture as decadent. Hypocrisy has always traveled well. Legionaries posted in Syria, Rome's eastern frontier, developed a distinct identity. Their armor was lighter, their tactics more flexible, their units more integrated with local auxiliaries. They built fortresses along desert ridges and learned how to fight in heat and dust rather than forests and hills. One quirky fact: Roman officers in the East sometimes adopted Parthian fashion, wearing trousers, scandalous in Rome, flowing cloaks, and even riding camels when needed. Efficiency over tradition. Shocking. So what did Rome learn from Carry? They learned that discipline wasn't enough, that not every battlefield could be won by sheer formation, that mobility, adaptability, and intelligence mattered just as much as steel. But most of all, they learned that some enemies can't be crushed, only endured. The Parthians had made their point. Rome, bruised but never broken, would try again. The drums beat a steady rhythm as you stand atop a desert fortress, eyes squinting toward the horizon. The sun has barely risen, yet the air already shimmers with heat. Below, a caravan of camels lumbers past, bearing silk, spices, and whispers from the east. You're stationed in the Roman province of Syria, and though your sword is sharp, it's diplomacy, not battle, that wins most wars here, at least for now. This is the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire in the 2nd century CE, a place where the legions aren't just soldiers. They're ambassadors, engineers, lawmen, and occasionally, reluctant archaeologists. Following the chaos of Carrhae, the emperors who came after Crassus approached the east with a mixture of caution and ambition. One of the most successful, Trajan, crowned in 98 CE, he expanded Roman territory farther than any emperor before or after. His dream, to finally break Parthia and make Mesopotamia Roman. In 113 CE, Trajan launched a massive campaign. His legions marched through Armenia, then swept into northern Mesopotamia, capturing city after city. At the height of the campaign, Trajan stood victorious in Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital. For a brief moment, it looked like Rome had done the impossible, toppled its eastern nemesis. But holding land and keeping it are two very different things. Parthian resistance flared up. Local governors rebelled. And back in the west, Judea erupted in a brutal revolt known as the Kitos War, forcing Rome to divert troops. Trajan, now aging and ill, never returned to Rome. He died in 117 CE during the journey back, and his successor, Hadrian, immediately abandoned the Mesopotamian conquests. Historians still argue whether Hadrian's withdrawal was a smart strategic move or a cowardly retreat. What's undeniable is that he understood something vital. Borders are easier to manage than ambitions. Hadrian wasn't a conqueror, he was a consolidator. He strengthened the empire's boundaries, including that iconic wall in Britain, and invested heavily in infrastructure. His legions became builders as much as fighters. Roads, aqueducts, and outposts popped up everywhere, especially across the eastern provinces. But the region remained volatile. In 132 CE, Judea ignited again under Simon Bar Kokhba, a charismatic and ruthless leader who declared himself Messiah and rallied thousands against Roman rule. The Bar Kokhba revolt wasn't just a skirmish. It was a full-blown war that saw entire Roman legions annihilated and Jerusalem temporarily reclaimed by rebels. Rome's response was intense. Hadrian sent his best general, Julius Severus, and legions from across the empire, including reinforcements from Britain and the Danube. The conflict dragged on for nearly 4 years. The Romans eventually crushed the rebellion, but at horrific cost. Over 500,000 Jews killed, cities destroyed, and Judea virtually erased from maps, renamed Syria Palestina as punishment. The legions left behind burned villages, plowed over sacred sites, and built a Roman city over the ruins of Jerusalem, Aelia Capitolina, complete with a temple to Jupiter. It was a scorched earth victory, the kind that leaves scars on history. Yet even in this brutality, the Eastern legions evolved. They weren't just enforcers anymore, they had to be adaptable. Guerrilla warfare, desert ambushes, temple politics, all part of the job. By the late 2nd century, the eastern borderlands were bustling with activity. Trade caravans flowed from Persia, India, even China. Silk arrived in Rome, and Roman glassware ended up in Han tombs. The legions guarding these trade routes had to keep the peace while also managing customs, local diplomacy, and the occasional camel theft. Some soldiers picked up Eastern religions, like the cult of Mithras, which involved underground rituals, sacred meals, and, yes, symbolic bull slaying. Mithraic temples, called Mithraea, started popping up in forts from Syria to the Rhine. Religion, like everything else, was now a fusion. Even military tactics began to shift. The legions began recruiting more Eastern auxiliaries, archers from Syria, cavalry from Cappadocia, slingers from the Levant. They fought differently, dressed differently, but they bled Roman red just the same. A quirky footnote. In one outpost near modern-day Iraq, archaeologists found graffiti left by a Roman soldier complaining about local bread being too chewy and the water tasting like goat. Some things, it seems, never change. And still, the greatest enemy remained: Persia. The Parthians eventually fell, replaced in the 3rd century by the Sasanian Empire, a more centralized, more aggressive Persian dynasty. Their kings were bold, their armies disciplined, and their propaganda top-tier. They called themselves the Kings of Kings and declared Rome an illegitimate empire. Tensions escalated into open warfare. Battles flared along the Euphrates River in Armenia and deep into Mesopotamia. One campaign even saw the Roman Emperor Valerian captured in battle. a rare, humiliating moment in Roman history. He was paraded through Persian cities as a trophy, and depending on the account you believe, he either died in captivity or was used as a human mounting block by Persian royalty. Yikes! Despite the setbacks, the legions never fully lost the East. They built, rebuilt, and held on. Cities like Palmyra rose as symbols of this frontier strength, a hybrid of Roman grandeur and desert resilience. Palmyra was ruled at one point by the legendary Queen Zenobia, who defied both Rome and Persia, leading her armies in open rebellion. She captured Egypt, declared herself empress, and faced off against Emperor Aurelian before being defeated and dragged to Rome in chains. Though, legend has it, she lived the rest of her life in a villa, sipping wine and speaking Greek poetry. As you do. By the end of the 3rd century, the Eastern Front had become Rome's most strategic theater. The banners snap in the highland wind as you scan the peaks of Armenia, one gloved hand shading your eyes. Snow dusts the rocks, and far below, valleys stretch toward Persia like a map drawn in relief. You're stationed in the Caucasus, the narrow neck where empires crash into each other, Rome, Persia, Armenia, and everything in between. It's the 4th century CE, and the Eastern Roman Empire is rising from the shifting weight of history. The West, once the glorious heart of conquest, is starting to creak. But the East is getting clever. Under Diocletian and later Constantine, Rome went through a kind of military and political makeover. The empire was now too vast, too stressed, and too threatened to be governed from a single marble chair in Rome. So they split it. Not officially at first, just a division of labor. But by 285 CE, it was clear. There was a Western Roman Empire and an Eastern Roman Empire. The East had the money, the cities, the trade routes, and, crucially, the legions that actually got paid. One of the smartest moves? Reorganizing the army. Instead of relying solely on massive legions that lumbered across provinces like ancient tanks, emperors like Diocletian created mobile field armies, the comitatenses, fast-moving, flexible, able to react to threats before they boiled over. At the same time, Limitanii, border troops, held the frontiers and ran daily operations like customs, patrols, and the occasional skirmish with nomads. The result, Rome was leaner, meaner, and, at least for a time, better at defense than it had ever been. And it needed to be, because the Sasanian Persians weren't just a nuisance anymore, they were obsessed with breaking Rome. Under rulers like Shapur II, Persian armies surged west again and again, probing for weaknesses. Cities like Nisibis and Amida were under constant threat. These were fortress cities, packed with soldiers and refugees, like iron lungs holding the breath of empire. The siege of Amida in 359 CE, for instance, lasted months and saw siege towers taller than city walls, were elephants tearing through gates, and streets flooded with blood and boiling oil. It was a siege so brutal that the Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who survived it, wrote that even hardened veterans broke down weeping at the scale of death. And then, in 363 CE, something truly wild happened. Emperor Julian, a philosopher-warrior who wore a beard to annoy the Senate, decided to invade Persia in what can only be described as an overconfident death march. He crossed the Tigris with 60,000 men, won a few battles, and then didn't plan an exit strategy. Trapped deep in enemy territory, his supply lines cut, he died in a skirmish, pierced by a spear under mysterious circumstances. Some say it was a Persian. Others whisper it was one of his own. The campaign ended in disaster. His successor, Jovian, was forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty, ceding key territories back to Persia just to get the army home alive. But military defeats weren't the only thing changing the East. Religion was reshaping everything. When Constantine embraced Christianity in the early 4th century, he didn't just shift personal belief, he rewired Roman identity. Temples once guarded by legionaries were replaced with basilicas. Standard-bearers marched with Chi-Rho symbols instead of eagles. And in the field, soldiers now prayed to a single god, even as they sharpened gladii before battle. It was a strange blend, monotheism and militarism, crosses and catapults. The new capital, Constantinople, founded in 330 CE, became the epicenter of this Christianized empire. Surrounded by walls thicker than dreams, it was a city built to last. And the Eastern legions, now increasingly recruited from Anatolia, Syria, and Thrace, were its spine. Here's a quirky twist. Many of these soldiers now fought not for Rome, but for the emperor himself, often viewed as God's chosen. Warfare took on a kind of divine justification. Victories were miracles, defeats, tests of faith. Meanwhile, enemies multiplied. To the north, Gothic tribes were stirring. Pushed by pressure from the east, specifically Hunnic horsemen sweeping down from Central Asia, they began pressing against the Danube frontier. The legions stationed there, many now Limitanei, weren't equipped for full-scale invasions. They could delay, not defeat. In 376 CE, the Gothic crisis came to a head. Refugees begged for Roman asylum across the Danube. The Emperor Valens, ruling from the east, allowed them in, poorly fed, poorly managed, and poorly respected. Within 2 years, the Gothic War had erupted. And then came Adrianople 378 CE. Valens, eager to win alone and ahead of reinforcements, marched out to meet the Goths with around 20,000 men. He underestimated them badly. The Goths, hiding cavalry in a nearby forest, launched a devastating flanking attack. The Roman army was shattered. Valens himself died, burned alive in a farmhouse according to some accounts. The Eastern army had suffered one of the worst defeats in Roman history. Adrianople sent shockwaves through the empire. If barbarians could destroy a Roman field army, what else could they do? The Eastern legions recovered, but slowly. Reforms followed. New units were raised. Tactics adapted again. Cavalry, once the empire's weak spot, was strengthened. The Clibanarii, heavily armored horsemen inspired by Persian cataphracts, became more prominent. A blend of East and West, Rome and Persia, tradition and innovation. Still, the writing was on the wall. The Western Roman Empire was beginning to crumble, choked by politics, corruption, and invasions it couldn't repel. But the East, it would endure. The legions there, tempered by Persian fire and Gothic steel, weren't just survivors. They were transformers, holding fast not just to power, but to purpose. And soon they would be reborn, not as Romans but as something new, something Byzantine. You pace atop the walls of Constantinople as the city stretches before you, golden domes glinting under the morning sun. Below, soldiers drill in tidy formations, priests chant beneath mosaics of angels, and merchants unload silks from eastern caravans. The air smells like incense and iron. You are not a Roman legionary, not in the old sense. You are a soldier of the Byzantine Empire, and though the banners still bear the eagle, the world has changed. It's the 5th century CE, and the Roman Empire in the West has collapsed. Gone. Sacked by Visigoths, overrun by Vandals, carved up by petty kings. But the East, the empire centered on Constantinople, remains. Stronger, richer, and more sophisticated than ever. Some call it the Byzantine Empire. But here's the thing, the people living in it still call themselves Romans. Their enemies do too. And their soldiers, your fellow warriors, march under the same imperial purple, fight with the same disciplined formations, though with more bows now, and still chant Latin battle cries, mixed in with Greek and a dozen other languages. Because this isn't the empire of Caesar or Trajan. This is an empire of survivors. Now let's talk about the military. The structure has shifted, but the soul remains. The massive legions of the past have been replaced with smaller, more mobile units called tagmata, elite regiments stationed near the capital, and thematic armies, regional forces raised from locals and trained to defend their own land. These soldiers are deeply woven into society. In the theme system, soldiers are given land to farm, and in return, they provide military service. It's genius, self-sustaining defense. A farmer by day, a warrior by royal decree. If you're stationed in Anatolia, you protect Anatolia. If you're in Thrace, you know every goat path that leads to your vineyard, and every shortcut to ambush a raiding party. And speaking of raiders, there are plenty. In the Balkans, the Slavs and Bulgars test the northern frontiers. In the east, the Sasanian Persians still dream of taking Constantinople. The Byzantine military must constantly adapt, and it does so with a mix of old-school Roman tactics and fresh, Eastern flair. Siege weapons are advanced. Intelligence networks are active. Cavalry dominates the battlefield now, especially the cataphracts, heavy horsemen clad in iron scale, charging with long spears and terrifying momentum. Think medieval tanks, but with better grooming. And then there's the real game-changer, Greek fire. Imagine this, a naval battle on the Bosphorus. Enemy ships advancing, their sails full, their oars churning foam. Then, thwump! A stream of liquid flame arcs through the air and ignites on contact, burning on water. Panic, chaos, horror. Greek fire is the Byzantine superweapon, closely guarded, delivered by bronze siphon cannons or clay grenades. To this day, historians don't know exactly how it was made. Still debated, was it naphtha, quicklime, whale fat, a wizard's recipe? One thing's certain, it worked. And now let's meet a few battlefield celebrities. First, Belisarius, the general who served under Justinian I in the 6th century. This guy was the closest thing to a Roman hero in the old mold. He reconquered huge swaths of lost Western territory, North Africa, Italy, parts of Spain, with far fewer troops than you'd expect. He was cunning, disciplined, and loyal, mostly. One of his most famous victories, the Battle of Dara, where Belisarius used clever trench systems and tactical deception to outmaneuver a larger Persian army. It was chess with spears. His soldiers held formation like iron against the wind, and he delivered one of the greatest tactical victories of the late Roman world. Then there's the Nika riots, not a battle per se but an urban war. When political factions in Constantinople rioted, burning parts of the city and threatening Justinian's throne, Belisarius and fellow General Mundus led troops into the Hippodrome, where over 30,000 rebels were slaughtered in a single day. Brutal? Yes. Effective? Also yes. Sometimes the empire bled its own to survive. But survival was always the point. Over time, the Byzantines stopped trying to conquer everything and instead focused on lasting. They became masters of defense, diplomacy, and delay. Sometimes they fought enemies with coin purses instead of swords, bribing one tribe to attack another, signing treaties that bought a decade of quiet. Was it honorable? Debatable. Was it smart? Absolutely. Here's a weird one. The Byzantine army often used psychological warfare. They'd deliberately send small, elite units to act vastly more numerous than they were, marching them in circles, changing flags, spreading rumors. One emperor reportedly staged a battlefield light show with mirrors and polished shields to appear as if divine forces were joining him. And let's not forget their intelligence agency, the Bureau of Barbarians. Sounds like a metal band, but it was real, part spy network, part diplomatic corps, part PR machine. They kept tabs on everything beyond the borders. By now, Latin was fading. The language of the army was mostly Greek, mixed with whatever the recruits brought from their homelands: Armenian, Syriac, Coptic, Slavic tongues. Orders were barked in a dozen dialects, but the shields still formed perfect walls, and the archers still fired in synchronized volleys. Even religion shaped battle. The Byzantines believed their emperor ruled by divine right, and every victory was a reflection of heaven's favor. Icons were carried into battle. Saints were invoked. And after a win, the churches rang with hymns of thanksgiving, mixing incense with blood-soaked steel. So what are we left with? A military machine that wasn't the same as it had been centuries before, but was still very much Roman in essence. Disciplined, adaptive, and built to last. You walk the battlements of Constantinople and feel it. This is no dying empire. This is a transformed empire. Older, yes. Wiser, definitely. And while it no longer dreams of world conquest, it's learned something more important: how to endure. The wind howls over the craggy Anatolian highlands as you tighten your grip on the reins. Below, a glimmer of steel moves like mercury across the landscape. Another marching column, another campaign. You are a soldier in the 10th century Byzantine Empire, and though you still call yourself a Roman, your war is unlike any Caesar ever imagined. By now, the empire is a creature of adaptation. It has survived plagues, invasions, revolts, and more emperors than most scribes care to count. And its army? A living fossil that has evolved into something both ancient and cutting-edge. You wear lamellar armor now, rows of small, overlapping metal plates stitched onto leather or cloth. It's lighter than the old legionary cuirass, more flexible in the mountains and plains of the east. Your comrades include Varangians, hulking axe-wielding mercenaries from the north, loyal to the emperor alone, and Turkic horse archers, borrowed from the playbooks of former enemies. This army fights in formations no Roman of the Republic would recognize, yet it obeys the same core principles. Discipline, training, logistics. Always logistics. A Roman army still travels with its own cooks, engineers, surveyors, and priests. And yes, still with its own bureaucrats recording grain distribution down to the last sack. Your general is Nikephoros Phokas, the White Death of the Saracens. He doesn't give stirring speeches. He gives orders, and he gets results. In 960 CE, Nikephoros launches a campaign to reclaim Crete, lost for over a century to Muslim pirates and raiders. The landing is brutal, narrow beaches, fortified ports, but the Byzantine forces are well prepared. They bring siege towers, naval support, and terrifying persistence. After a long siege, the capital, Chandax, falls. The island rejoins the empire. 2 years later, he leads the army east, driving into Cilicia, Syria, and even Antioch, long lost to the Arab Caliphate. For the first time in centuries, the eastern frontier starts pushing forward. But this isn't a clash of good versus evil. It's empire versus empire. Both sides claim divine backing. Both sides use spies, tricks, and fire. The cities taken 1 year are retaken the next. It's like playing tug-of-war on a fault line. And then comes perhaps the most famous of all, Basil II, the Bulgar Slayer. He reigns for nearly 5 decades, from 976 to 1025 CE, and he doesn't waste a day. His lifelong campaign against the Bulgarian Empire is part war, part obsession. The Bulgars are fierce and stubborn, resisting Roman authority from the mountains of the Balkans. The war drags on for decades, full of sieges, betrayals, and narrow victories. Finally, in 1014 CE, Basil crushes the Bulgarian army at the Battle of Clydion. What happens next? He blinds 99 out of every 100 prisoners, leaving the last in each group with a single eye to lead the others home. When their czar, Samuel, sees his mutilated army return, he reportedly dies of a heart attack. It's brutal, it's excessive, but it's effective. By the end of Basil's reign, the Byzantine Empire is the strongest it's been in 400 years, stretching from southern Italy to Armenia, from the Danube to the edges of the Holy Land. But even this golden age has cracks. The thematic army system begins to weaken. Wealthy landowners absorb smaller farms. Local militias vanish. The empire starts relying more on mercenaries, cheap, fast, and dangerously disloyal. The Varangian Guard becomes the emperor's personal bodyguard, famed for discipline and violence, but paid in loot and gold. Meanwhile, the military manuals written by scholars and veterans, beautiful, detailed books like the Strategikon, are increasingly ignored. Strategy gives way to court politics. Armies are used less for defense and more for civil war between rival generals. And then, in 1071, everything changes. The Battle of Manzikert. Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes leads a massive army against the rising Seljuk Turks in eastern Anatolia. He's confident, perhaps too confident. His forces include regulars, mercenaries, and allies of dubious loyalty. The Seljuks, under Alp Arslan, feign retreat, draw the Byzantines into rough terrain, and then unleash a devastating counterattack. Romanos is captured. His army disintegrates, and within years, Anatolia, the empire's heartland, is lost. Historians still debate whether it was poor planning, betrayal, or just bad luck that led to the catastrophe. But the result is clear. The Byzantine military, so long the shield of civilization, is fractured. The empire staggers. Civil wars erupt. Provinces rebel. And in the West, the Pope, seeing weakness and opportunity, calls for a crusade, not to save Byzantium, but to retake the Holy Land. Soon, Latin crusaders will arrive. At first allies, then, well, we know how that ends. But even after defeat, after retreat, after betrayal and sackings, the soldiers of the East endure. In backwater forts and battered city walls, they keep the flame alive. Their formations might be smaller now, their armor more patchwork, but their legacy is unmatched, because for over 1,000 years, from Hannibal to Manzikert, through catapults, crosses, and composite bows, Roman soldiers marched through history with sandals in one era and stirrups in the next. Not invincible, but relentless. And even when the empire fades, their memory will linger, in tactics, in titles, even in the languages of modern armies. They were the legions. They were Rome. And they never stopped marching.